So your faith in humanity is challenged and immediately restored. And then you take that case, you appear in front of a judge who gets it.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. And in this episode, for those of you who like true crime, we have Orange County prosecutor extraordinaire and author of The Book of Murder. I've already recommended it to a ton of friends. The Book of Murder, our guest is the Matt Murphy.
It is. That is our guest. And this is a treat to have another lawyer on the call today.
Oh, this time I was the odd one out.
Yeah. Well, no, didn't he say he was a philosophy undergrad major?
He studied philosophy.
Yeah.
I knew it when
sense.
he said it. Because when I was reading his book, I knew it.
But the real point is, this is an actual real lawyer. He was a prosecutor. He's done tons of trials. He was involved with the dating game, murderer trials, and he's done a lot. He's seen a lot of nasty things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm somebody who is obsessed with film noir and, that underbelly of society and the crime. And I see it up on the screen. I'm like, oh, wow, that's crazy. Look at these people. Oh, my gosh. This guy actually lived it and knows the underbelly of society, lived through crime. And it's really interesting to hear his take on some of the things that are, going on in our country. What are some of the benefits of tougher tariffs if it means that, we can cut down on X amount of fentanyl getting into our country? He was given some examples of the dangers of fentanyl and why he thinks that, look, yes, tariffs suck. And yes, this is very terrible. But let me give you guys a story about how awful these drugs are. Once again, our podcast is here to provide unique perspectives from people that you just normally don't talk to.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guest host on ABC News whenever crime comes up. Very reputable attorney. Just all around awesome guy. The Surfer released a new book. Gwen, you'll talk about the book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I love about our podcast is we're giving some unique perspectives. And Gwen, I'll put you on the spot again with this one. A new thing about our show. What are some philosophical tenets of this episode? What did we cover for our hardcore philosophers out there?
Well, there's a big debate about free will versus determinism, and we've talked about it. And one of the questions that I had as I was reading his book was the cases are so extraordinary, the cases of homicide. And the death penalty is on the table for those cases. And my question was, with these extraordinary cases, what service is the death penalty for that? Because I understand the logic of the death penalty. Some people say it's a deterrent, but the cases he worked on in particular, it doesn't seem like anything would deter the type of person who would do the type of crime that he did. So I was just very curious about what his understanding of the function of that was, that penalty, and also what his understanding of justice was. Another thing that really stood out to me in his book was he made a reference to the philosopher Descartes, and he did that in the context of witnessing an autopsy. And it really struck me at how thoughtful his work was, because we often have this collision of theory with the real world, or what is really in front of us. And that is something he expressed. And it's one of the reasons I was drawn to his work, because a lot of true crime, which I have enjoyed and consumed and all that stuff, I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but his book is different in that it really focuses on the puzzle of solving the crime, of like finding this little thread and pulling on it. And you're along for the journey for understanding how to put the case together. And he also consistently highlights the families and the victims. And that is something that you don't see in a lot of true crime. A lot of it is focused on the criminal, on the perpetrator, and almost glorifying or sensationalizing them. His work does not do that. And I really, really appreciated his approach to disclosing what it was like to be a prosecutor of these high-profile cases, and even to work with Anna Kendrick as a consultant on her film Woman of the Hour, which I loved. Okay, Matt Murphy is amazing. This is a real treat for all of you. And let's get started. We're going to be talking about, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to call it? I always get stuck on this.
Did you give the name of his book before we move forward?
The Book of Murder.
The Book of Murder. Okay, so let's talk, I don't know, you want to say let's talk murder with Matt Murphy?
Let's talk murder with Matt Murphy. It's a go.
Not to start off with something controversial,
What?
just hold on.
Is there any other way?
If you really don't want to answer this question, I get it. But you just brought up the fentanyl fold. I'm very familiar with it, not because I have ever been in the fentanyl fold, but I've seen it. Something that we are seeing today with respect to at least part of the posturing and negotiations with the country of Mexico is that the new administration wants that country and some other countries to crack down on the fentanyl flowing into the United States. Obviously, who wants more fentanyl into the United States? But I'm just curious, hearing what you just said and being a former prosecutor, what are your thoughts about that? Is that even a tangible thing that can be achieved?
Downtown LA it's overrun, and California is even worse. Newsom recently called it an intractable problem, and I don't think I agree with that. When you work homicides, and as a prosecutor especially, you see homeless crime all the time. A lot of them, they tend to fight with each other. A lot of them are, as we know, mentally ill. Some of them, it's a combination of mentally ill and drug abuse. So it's not just having the tent pitched someplace that looks bad. There's a whole associated range of kind of quality of life issues that happen in any community where there's a lot of people. And this is without any judgment. This is just objective impact. And I heard a great term recently, toxic empathy. And I think that's something that
Wow.
really should enter the lexicon of the homeless problem at this point. Because, I mean, I can tell you my own personal evolution on that is I was that college kid that couldn't walk by a homeless person without giving him a buck. And then I lived in Laguna for 4 years, and it was the same thing. Like I really just on a purely empathetic wavelength, I just felt so sorry for them, like where their lives gone wrong and all that. And then I got transferred to South Court in Orange County, and those same guys went onto my caseload, and I began reading rap sheets, and it hardened my heart a little bit. This was 25 years ago. This is before a lot of the policy decisions in California essentially invited a lot of the components of this problem. There's always going to be homeless people, but I think that when you make it so that they are almost encouraged to come to California, and there's a lawsuit filed by the ACLU that nobody ever talks about, where essentially police officers now, if they're going to arrest a homeless person, they're mandated to pack up their shopping cart and inventory it. A big part of my practice now is representing police officers, and it's just that alone creates such a massive disincentive to enforcing the law with people that are homeless. Because, first of all, they're going to get scabies going through all their stuff. And then the little critter is going to hang around the police department. They'll be out probably before the inventory is even complete. It kills their entire shift. And then they're going to beef the cop for stealing their favorite pair of scissors or something. It's a creation of policy that, it's one of the many factors in the collage, I think, of the homeless problem in Southern California. But part of it, certainly, like if when you're talking about fentanyl, I had a homicide case for review at a Newport once where it was a high-end club, and I'll leave the name of the club out of it, but they had internal video, and one of the bouncers was selling cocaine inside this place. He got a batch of cocaine that was laced with fentanyl. It was 5 or 6 guys, and they come out of the bathroom, and you see them on camera. One drops, and then another drops, and these guys go down because they think they're buying cocaine. They all OD on fentanyl. But what they do with fentanyl overdoses, and this is about 10 years ago. So this is when people are still learning the science of it, when fentanyl was still relatively new. And by people, I mean emergency personnel and first responders. So the fentanyl is a synthetic opiate. The answer is they give Narcan, it's antagonistic to organic opiates like heroin, right? Well, so, and I forgot what the numbers are, but essentially if a natural heroin OD, like think Train Spotting or some movie like that, right? Which has a couple of great OD scenes in it. But if you OD on natural heroin and the natural heroin stays in your body for say 4 hours, Narcan will stay in your body for 6. So if you got somebody who's having an OD and they inject them with the Narcan, when they come to, which is instantaneous in a lot of instances, they're good to go because the Narcan is going to remain in their body long after the heroin's gone. With fentanyl or an actual metabolite of that called carfentanil, it'll stay in your body for and again, I don't know the numbers, but it'll be in there for like 10 hours instead of 4. So the 6 hours. So what happened in that case is everybody gets their Narcan. Everybody comes to, and it's like 2 or 3 in the morning at this point. everybody gets interviewed, and then one of the guys goes to sleep, and the Narcan wore off, but the carfentanil didn't, and the carfentanil kicked back in, and he died.
Oh my God.
It is such a devastating drug, and it is so dangerous. I mean, the numbers are staggering. When you're talking about over 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States, the federal government, and whether that's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, I don't really care who it is. Like, I think any nation has a vested interest in sort of doing what they can to restrict the flow, at least to the point that maybe the prices go up, and somebody's son who's living in a tent because they've made some bad choices, maybe he can't afford it that day, and there's one less OD. I
Right.
mean, it's a very complicated issue. But also, look, a lot of that stuff is actually coming in from the cartels. The cartels pretty much own any smuggling operations, including people. And the idea of making it harder for people to get it, I mean, it can't hurt. And, the story of that is actually really interesting. The person who really went all in on fentanyl was El Chapo's son, who's basically running that cartel now, or was for a while at least. The idea of U.S. law enforcement doing what they can to crack down on it, I can tell you what has been tried so far on relaxing everything isn't working. It's kind of like needle exchanges. The idea behind it is totally well-meaning. You want to try to slow down the spread of Hep C and HIV and all of the myriad of horrific diseases that come from using dirty needles, right? So they set up free needle exchanges in LA, which is, again, it's an empathetic thing to do, but it's not for free. And then, I live in Manhattan Beach, and I surf after the first good rain. We just had it. All those things in downtown LA, the storm drains aren't filtered in any way. So all those
Right.
homeless people that use those needles, they throw them down the storm drains, and it's like a friggin' syringe fiesta on the beaches of, because the California current, of course, goes north south. It all washes down to the beaches of like Torrance, Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach. It's a real problem. The intent was good, but the result, I don't know if there's been any measurable decrease in the transmission of HIV or Hep C or any of these other horrific diseases as a result of needle exchanges. I know we're paying for it. So I don't know. I think like a lot of people, when it comes to stuff like that, I grew up in LA. I went to UCSB for undergrad. I went to law school in California. I'm as California as they come. The only political party I've ever belonged to was the Democratic Party, but I left that because I couldn't take it anymore about 15 years ago as a DA. Now I'm an independent. I think a lot of people here started out with this really empathetic thing. And then, I read a very interesting article about the homeless fires actually being responsible for at least one of the big fires that just ravaged the hills of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Reality is kind of banging on our door here in California regarding the homeless problem, I think.
That's right. I think it is. Just for the record, this is very, very important. Gwen, I know our audience must wonder, Rudy lives in Manhattan Beach. Why doesn't he ever talk about surfing? It's because of the needles. So Matt just gave the
That's
reason
not true.
why
You just don't
I
want to
don't
ruin your
surf.
hair.
That is the reason. I just want to put that for the record.
Matt,
Now
you
it's in
can't
the
see
record.
this, but Rudy has perfect hair.
That's correct.
Okay, I wish I did.
Well, actually, Rudy, I'm glad you started out with this question. And Matt, I'm really glad because this is something I've been thinking about with your book. When we are talking about crimes and we, do a bird's eye view, whether it be theft or drinking or driving, we can put in policies to kind of curb or introduce new causal factors to impact behavior and decrease crime. Like we can study it and see what works. We can look at cities that have little crime and see what they're doing and if that can be implemented somewhere else. We can do that. However, when I am reading your book, which is, like I said, all engrossing. I've told everybody I ignored my family, I ignored the news, I ignored everybody until I finished your book because I loved it so much. When we are hearing these cases that you have prosecuted with these particular acts of homicide, what possible policy could have prevented that? Like, it seems like the cases that you have tried are unique where I can't think of anything that would have derailed that person from committing the murder. So that's where I'm kind of like, what do we do about that kind of a criminal that it doesn't fit the same paradigm as like okay, let's talk about homelessness, or let's talk about theft. And you can do all of these things. But is there
Yeah.
anything that could have derailed the particular kind of murderer that you deal with? And if not, then that's where one of my questions is about something like the death penalty, because it seems like if anybody were to qualify for the death penalty, it would be these people. But then it couldn't be a deterrent because it wasn't a deterrent for them in the first place, and it wouldn't deter others because other people's brains don't work that way. So that's what I just kind of want to know about, like the psychology of the killer that you prosecute, and what do you think about? Is there any prevention?
Yeah, so it depends on the kind of murder that we're talking about. And
Mm-hmm.
for like a child abuse murder, that's a one-off, or a domestic violence murders, we are just always going to have those, I think. And you're absolutely right. Or even some of the bar fights. So one punch bar fight is a tragically common way that homicides are committed. Probably around the world. You get two drunks yelling at each other. Somebody punches the other guy and he hits his head on the table, or just, knocks him out unconscious on his feet and they hit their head on the cement. People die from that all the time. I don't think there's much of anything we could ever do to stop those. But there are certain types of murders where I think policy definitely can have an impact. And that, the one that jumps out first for me are the sexually violent predators, because there's a certain percentage of every population, going back to ancient Greece and probably far beyond that, that are just going to be predatory. When you have, and whatever that percentage is, whether it's 1% of the population, 5% of the population, the math is kind of simple at the end. For simplicity, let's say it's just 5% of the population has the capacity to commit violent crimes and prey on other people. The more of those guys that you take out of circulation for the longer period of time, the less innocent victims you're going to have. So when it comes to something like stranger rape, right now, if there's no enhancements, right now, the law in California is it's an 8-year prison sentence, and depending on the circumstances, you're going to do 85% time. So essentially, for a generic rape, that guy's going to be out in probably a little over 6 years, the way things currently go. Now, if there's a kidnapping involved or there's great bodily injury inflicted, that changes the equation. But the generic 261 rape has an 8-year max. If you're talking about somebody that has all the hallmarks of sexual predation, like it's a stranger rape, that guy's chances are awful good that guy's going to do it again. So on one hand, you're absolutely right. There's nothing we're going to be able to do really to discourage that guy from having the will to go out and sexually prey on children or women or men or whatever it is, whatever the focus of their victims are. On the other hand, as a society, we can certainly take steps to keep them in longer. And that might sound a little
Mm-hmm.
draconian, but the formula is pretty easy on that. Like, the longer that guy's in, the less opportunity he's going to have to prey on the innocent people of the community that you're going to release him into when he gets out. And so when it comes to the death penalty, it's a very emotional debate. I think that's one where there really are excellent points on both sides. It's one of those things that I went into law school. I had no particular leanings one way or another on that. I certainly didn't in college. And then even when I started as a DA, I didn't really have much of a dog in that fight. I had no great personal feelings. I did have a friend that was murdered in law school, but it was a guy he was a union rep, and he was murdered by a guy who was getting fired, and it was never a death case. Like, it wasn't one of those cases that rose to that level. But then when you start doing them, and you actually start looking at those cases more closely. And I sat on our committee for about 15 years. So the way it works is any special circumstance murder. So you have generic murders, and then you have murders that are what are known as special circumstances. That's a murder committed during the course of a robbery, during the course of a rape, a kidnapping, shooting from an occupied vehicle. There's a bunch of things that qualify as what are known as special circumstances in the state of California. So every special circ homicide in Orange County would have to go in front of our committee. And we would make a recommendation to the elected DA whether to seek death or seek LWOP, which is life without possibility of parole. And for the cases that were eligible, you might find this interesting, but in the 15 years I was on the committee in Orange County, we recommended death in less than 4% of all of the cases that were eligible for the death penalty. So that's a subset of all the murders. I mean, it would have to be somewhere less than 2% of the homicides would we seek the death penalty on. And so the two criteria were zero rational doubt about guilt. I mean, the guy
Mhm.
actually did it. There's no lingering doubt in the minds of the people in the committee. And then on top of that, it had to be something truly horrific, so that you immediately wash out pretty much every gang murder, unless it's like an innocent child that gets killed. And even then, I don't think we sought death on any of those. It's truly reserved for the really worst of the worst, like the Hawks murder, where people were tied to an anchor begging for their lives and thrown overboard. And and two
Oh,
people were murdered for money.
that was an incredible story.
Yeah, or and in that one there was a third victim. There was a guy named John Jarvie who was murdered by Skylar for money the year before. So that's one. Or Rodney Alcala, who probably murdered 100 different women. But Alcala is actually a great example, and that's I think you mentioned my assistant, the Woman of the Hour with
Hmm.
Anna Kendrick, who is awesome, by the way. Anna Kendrick is I'm the world's biggest Anna Kendrick fan now. Alcala, he kidnapped and raped an 8-year-old girl in 1968. And then he fled and he got to New York and he was caught 3 years later working at an all-girls sleepaway camp in upstate Vermont. And the guy was extradited back. I personally, and I talked about this in the book, I can't believe they gave him the deal that they gave him. But he wound up getting what's known as an indeterminate sentence back then in the early 70s. So in 1971, he's sentenced to life in prison, but he gets a parole hearing. I think he got one. His first one might have been in 24 months, but he was released after committing that crime. 8-year-old girl he picked up off the street. She was in a coma for 32 days, and then he fled. They released him after 34 months in state prison. And when they got into his apartment or his little bungalow in Hollywood, they found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs because he was a graduate of UCLA Film School. So he worked as a professional photographer, and hundreds of photographs of boys, girls, and young women in positions of vulnerability with Rodney Alcala. And those things were lost to time. We never saw them. It was this batch. So anybody with a rational mind, especially on the California Board of Prison terms, like the parole officers, everybody should have seen that and said and thought there's no way we should let this guy out. But they did. And yeah, according to which detective you talk to and various pieces of involvement in the case, Rodney killed 100 people, after his release.
Hmm.
There's 4 in New York. I think he was convicted of 2. There's 1 in Wyoming. He was charged with that. There was 4 in LA County. There's 1 in Orange County. He's suspected of another. And in Marin, he was cleared to 1 in Marin. And he drove back across country at least twice. He got permission from his parole officer. So that guy was a monster.
And just for our audience purposes, just so because we do have a true crime kind of
Hmm.
fan base, not fan base, but analyzation. But Rodney Alcala, the dating game murderer. So if you've watched any of the movies about him, if you've listened to any of the
Woman of
podcasts,
the
that's what
Hour.
we're referring to.
Hmm.
Yeah, and Anna
Woman of
Kendrick's
the
Woman of the
Hour,
Hour.
the dating
Yeah.
game. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why his case is so fascinating. It's such a cautionary tale of a boogeyman. Like he's the guy. He's the don't take rides from strangers guy. And he was so prolific. And another thing about him, which is fascinating, I think, is that he had a mental level IQ. He had a mother who loved him. He was not abused by anybody that anybody was able to find in the multiple investigations into his various cases. He had a brother, older brother, who was amazingly successful, graduated from West Point, was a war hero. And Rodney was, with his genius IQ, went to UCLA and graduated from UCLA Film School. And he was handsome, charming as hell because he represented him in court. He represented himself in court like a lot of these guys want to do, which is another thing I think that's really interesting about serial killers. But I had to deal with them personally every day for about, 6 months or more through the trial. And he's a really charming guy. He had every advantage, a lot like Ted Bundy, good looking, smart guy. So going full circle to your question, it is a policy wise, what can we do to deter somebody like Rodney Alcala? We can't do anything to deter somebody like that. He is hardwired to want to go out and murder people and rape them in the most sadistic way possible. But what we can do is we can absolutely adopt policies to take them out of circulation after their first
Hmm.
violent crime. Another thing about Alcala, which stands out somewhat from a lot of serial killers, is that his prey item of choice, like from Jack the Ripper to, so many of these guys prey, like Rex Heuermann right now, who's been charged with a series, he's the Gilgo Beach guy in New York. So many of them focusing on sex workers because these are women that, as a part of the way they're making money to support themselves, they will put themselves in those positions of vulnerability, down the dark alleys, into the areas where nobody else is around. I mean, it's just a part of that profession, right? And so a lot of them focus in on that. Alcala would find women in bars and restaurants and follow them home. So his victims, they included legal secretary, which is what they called them back in the 70s, a pediatric cancer nurse named Georgia Wixit out of Malibu. Jill Parenteau was a computer programmer. Jill Barkham was a 18-year-old kid, just come to LA, like she was a hitchhiker. The families who showed up in that, even decades later, because we got a bunch of DNA hits out of Los Angeles County after California finally entered the CODIS system. But it is so striking how the ripple effect of that kind of emotional pain when you lose a loved one to the worst kind of murder imaginable. So in the death penalty debate, the whole idea of deterrence really it borders on being a straw dog argument. And we hear it all the time. You almost never hear that on like, are we deterring armed robbers by putting them in prison for 6 years? Or are we deterring child molesters by putting them in prison for 8 years? And I think the answer for true blue serial killers is no. The concept of being executed is zero deterrent. But for the family, it represents justice.
Okay.
And from that perspective, it gives them oftentimes, not always, because some people are philosophically or religiously opposed to the death penalty, but oftentimes it does present like some sense of peace for that family.
Closure or
Yeah, I could see. I mean, it's horrible to say, but I could almost imagine, right? God forbid, but I'm going to step myself into the shoes of the family. It's been 5 or 10 years since their loved one was taken away, but the murderer is in prison. They wake up in the middle of the night and they're sitting there thinking, wait, this person is still alive. This person has a bed. This person has food. Why is that happening? This is driving me crazy. I can't move on with I can't do anything. I could see that argument for the family. Is that what you're kind of alluding to,
Yeah,
Matt?
so it's not even so much that, it's not even carrying out the execution. And yes, but I didn't articulate it very well. The jury coming back as the voices of the community and essentially with their verdict, and it's a dramatic moment. And when they come back and they say, look, even though and everybody knows in California, we have a moratorium, like that nobody, I don't think, is ever going to be executed in California ever again. And there doesn't seem to be the political will. We have over 700 people on death row in California. But for the family, when you lose a loved one, like a cancer nurse, or even, I've done death penalty cases. My Andrew Rudy case was a serial killer, and he was solely preying, almost not solely, but the majority of his victims were sex workers. And even they have family members who love them. They're not all complete societal outcasts. A lot of them are tragically dealing with, struggling with addiction issues or mental health problems of their own. And that doesn't mean they don't have people who still love them. So when the jury comes back in and says, we've weighed the factors, the aggravating versus mitigating factors, and we find your loved one was so valuable to the world, or even just to you, that taking her life for sexual pleasure is so important to us that even though you're probably never going to get executed, you deserve to die for what you did. It can be very cathartic for the family. It's like the community has spoken through the verdict of the jury. And for a lot of families, that is a big deal. They recognize that the appeals are going to go on for decades and the person's probably never going to be executed. But for a lot of them, it gives them something. And for the truly horrific cases, even though it's 10 times the work and 10 times the appellate scrutiny for me as a prosecutor on the really, really bad ones, like the Skylar De Leon murder of Tom and Jackie Hawks, or Rodney Alcala, or Andrew Urdiales, it was, and these are horrific, sadistic murders. It was worth the extra work for me if I could bring any sort of solace to the family, even if it just gave them a little bit of peace knowing that they weren't alone and that the community felt their pain through the verdict. For me, it was worth it. And I think I speak for a lot of prosecutors in California that feel that way. Although, death penalty, if they eliminated it tomorrow, I also wouldn't necessarily lose any sleep over that personally, as long as they don't take out LWOP. And there's a movement in California to remove life without possibility of parole as a sentence. It's some of the controversy around what we're seeing with the Menendez brothers right now. And I'm telling you guys, it would be such a tragedy if those poor families would have to then start attending parole hearings every year to try to keep the murderer of their loved one in, because on a lot of murder cases, they have to do that. And that is horrific for the families.
Matt, I got to ask you a question if you
Sure.
don't mind. As I'm sitting here and I'm hearing your history. I'm hearing, I don't want to tie things to political parties or any kind of change. I too am an independent for many, many reasons, but I don't want to do that. This might be a sensitive question to answer, but you're a prosecutor for a very long time. I believe it was 26 years. I know you retired in 2019, and now you do a different type of a practice representing police officers in defense type work. But are you, the stuff that you saw that neither Gwen nor I know about, or like what people in the world know about? Because I'm sure there's plenty of cases that you weren't even able to prosecute, but you know of horrific things that happened. I mean, you know the true horror of humanity. I just got to ask you, and you did your part, and you were a great prosecutor. You did great things bringing people to justice, and you put your life into that. How do you deal with the information that you have in your head? Number one. And number two, is there a small part of you that says like, I wish I was just some municipal bond attorney who didn't piss off everybody in the world or see horrible things in the world? I want to know more. I want to know about you, but if
No,
that's
no, no,
too
it's not
sensitive,
sensitive.
let me
No, and
know.
I appreciate the question. No, so Orange County does it a little differently. The vertical system means we go to the scene. It's really kind of in your face. You see the dead body. You see your poor victim. We'd attend the autopsies. You're often there when the death notification is given to the family. The first thing I would always do after filing charges is arrange a meeting with victim witness and the victim's family so that I could kind of walk through the process with them. So you're right, Rudy. You see the absolute worst. But just beyond the dead body, there's that crime lab tech that is going through, doing their thing, and figuring out the most likely place a fingerprint might be. And then you see the other one swabbing, something that might have been used as the weapon. And then you watch the detectives, you get a front row seat. And so your faith in humanity is challenged immediately upon the horror of what you're looking at. And then when I'm watching those autopsies, there's a viewing room in Orange County, and sometimes it was important to actually see if there was going to be an issue regarding cause of death. It was important to go and observe that sometimes. So you're watching this horrific event, and I'll tell you, not to get too graphic, but when you're watching a scientific dissection of a human being that 24 hours before was going to college and laughing, it is a profound experience when you see somebody's body opened up. But then right next to me would be the lead detective on the case, sober, serious, taking notes. And right behind her or him is going to be the sergeant in charge of the homicide unit for whatever city you're working with. So your faith in humanity is challenged and immediately restored. And then you take that case and you appear in front of a judge who gets it. And then the defense will bring motions to suppress, and a different judge gets it and denies it. And then you wind up in front of a jury that seems to understand the enormity of their responsibility. So each case is you see that horror of humanity, and then it's your faith is kind of immediately restored on those cases. I'll tell you what is toxic, it's almost like mercury poisoning over time, are the macro and micro politics that you deal with. You'll see good cops that run afoul of the political structure of their office because the person that doesn't like them gets promoted to lieutenant, and that kind of stuff drives you crazy. Or in the DA's office, it's an elected position, and there are political considerations made, especially on the big cases. And some of that, I talked about this a little bit in the Samantha Runyon case. Little 6-year-old or almost 6-year-old guy kidnapped and murdered by a guy named Alejandro Avila. There was so much media on that case, and you see sort of some of the political maneuverings, and that's gross. That sort of wears you down over time. The funny thing about it is it's one of those things you can't really go half into it. If you go to homicide and you're working those cases vertically, you either have to get out if you don't take to it, or you got to go all in because your responsibility to those families is enormous, I think, if that makes sense.
And now a quick break to tell you about our sponsor for this episode of Good is in the Details. I want to tell you about Fishy Photo. I've gotten so many compliments on my photo, and I say, you know what? It is my friend Jamie of fishyphoto.com who does all the work. And I have her here today. Jamie, tell us about your business and what people can get out of getting their photos taken with you.
Well, first of all, thank you, because I love your photo shoots. And every time we do one, I'm super excited. I specialize in branding. I do headshots. I do family photos. I do product photography. I've been doing this for 25 plus years. I'm an Angelino, so you are getting someone who knows Los Angeles. I'm born and raised here, and I love bringing out the best in people. Nowadays, being transparent on social media, on your website, in your emails is more important, really, than ever, because with AI and everyone doing so many things digitally, no one knows who to trust. So having brand photos that are of you, doing what you do, showing your your personality, that is a game changer.
Authentic photos from Fishy Photo. That's FISHYFOTO.com. And now back to the show.
Would you say surfing helped you when you were out there and you're surfing? Because I saw that, surfed for 9 months in Australia before law school. I mean, it seems like it's a very important thing. Does that help other than the needles and the
once
AIDS
I
and the needles and everything? Does
once I
it cleanse you? Does
Other
it
than the
help you
yeah,
deal with
garbage.
it?
once I tiptoe through all the hype needles, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah.
helps a ton. And I'll tell you what helped me is a lot of those trips, like I talked about those in the book, going onto those boats, and the world seems like it's getting a little smaller every day because between Starlink and the cell towers that pop up everywhere, for years, when you got on one of those surf boats, you were just checked out. There was no cell phone that was going to work, and that really helped get my head together. You go from that to whatever's blowing up, whatever's happening, you can't deal with it. So it's like you have to shut your mind down. And I got a group of buddies I go with who are just a great bunch of guys, and they're, a lot of laughter, a lot of funny little, like, it's a bunch of dudes on a boat with the practical jokes and the smack talk, and it's, for me, it's restorative to do stuff like that. Golf trips had a similar effect. If I like I went to Ireland with a bunch of buddies a couple years before I left the office, and we're so far away from California that whatever's happening back home is happening in the middle of the night. I could just focus on playing a little golf and having some fun. So yeah, trying to achieve that life balance is critical for your mental health in a unit like that.
And if this is controversial, I'm not trying to ask controversial questions, but like this conversation is so good and it's so relevant to what today, it's so relevant to what we're dealing with in this country. Would you say then that if more people knew what you know, or more people have been through what you've been through, if more people have had to associate or stand in front of the horrendous people that you've stood in front of, that people would be quote unquote less liberal or more tough on crime, more tough on these men? I'm not trying to be controversial. I'm just saying, like, is ignorance bliss in a certain sense?
Yeah, and look, one of the things I talk about in the book is that when you're talking about criminal prosecution, it should be as apolitical as possible. It really should. These concepts predate Democrats and Republicans. Like when you look at the cuneiform of Hammurabi, I talk about this in the book too. The Ten Commandments, really, those concepts of like murder is bad and you shouldn't steal or cheat, those predate Judaism even. They seem to be cultural universals. When you work in a law enforcement capacity and you get down into the nitty gritty and you see the real crimes that are committed, when it's somebody that commits a crime because they're on an early release program, and I can say this without being too politically incorrect, if we still use that word, but like George Gascon came in on a hard left point of view, and I am not a fan of any of that. Like the Gascon approach. So George Gascon, for your listeners, was that he was just voted out by like he lost the election by like 30 points. He came in after the summer of George Floyd. He defeated a friend of mine, Jackie Lacey, who was a lifelong Democrat, first woman who was the DA of Los Angeles County, I believe, first African American DA of LA County, and really a true trailblazer. From my perspective, a really nice person who wanted to do the job and was about doing the right thing and was the proper exercise of prosecutorial power. It's supposed to be apolitical. It's supposed to be based on fairness, not just to the victims, but to the defendants themselves. Gascon came in, and one of the first things he did, he forbade his prosecutors from attending BPT lifer hearings, which stands for the Board of Prison Terms. So the way it works is if you commit a murder in the state of California and you get a life sentence, you go in, you get a parole hearing for second degree murder in about 12 and a half years. The way it works in every county prior to the Gascons and maybe a couple others now is that the county where the murder comes from would send a prosecutor with the file to participate in the hearing. And look, some of those guys, depending on the circumstances of the murder, like a 18-year-old who's involved in a drive-by as a gangster who goes to prison and he's one of five guys who are involved, he might not even be the shooter, who programs properly, he gets out of the gang, he's at like a level 2 prison, he's got parole plans. and he could still have a life and be a contributing member of society. I had no issue with those guys getting out. Like, for some people truly don't pose an additional danger. And the job of the prosecutor is to basically go, yeah, here's what happened in the case, and you monitor it and you let the chips fall with the board. But a lot of times the murders are horrific. The parole hearing comes up way the hell too early. They come in and can I swear on this? Because it's like,
Go for it.
is that okay?
Go for
No, you guys
it.
Absolutely.
got me.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They come in and they come in with a completely bullshit story. It's like their own little game of telephone. They commit a horrific crime, and then they tell one silly a story, and then they hone it, and it gets a little better on the yard. And then 15 or 20 years later, they become this little lambykins on the way to the freaking bingo parlor, and they were totally innocent and everything. Like, I'm sorry if I can swear, fuck that guy. Like, when it comes to the victim's family on that, some mother whose son was killed in a robbery where the guy didn't need to
Mhm.
pull the trigger. And that guy has come up with some story about how the guy, he only shot him because he said something to him or aggravated him. Like, that guy should never get out. Justice says that guy shouldn't get out until they've like come to terms with what they've done, shown some actual remorse, properly programmed, and stop being such an a-hole. And the majority, I got to tell you guys, and I've done hundreds of those hearings, and the majority of them, and I've already acknowledged some of them do it right and they deserve to get out. But a majority are freaking a-holes who have no rational reason to be released because they're either going to do it again or they haven't paid a big enough price for what they did to that poor victim and that poor family. Gascon, as a blanket edict, his first day in office, forbid his prosecutors from attending a single BPT lifer hearing, which is outrageous. So that what that means is it becomes the adversarial system that we rely on, where the inmate has their own attorney who's going to advocate for them. The inmate gets to advocate for themselves, and all of a sudden you remove the prosecutor who's going to come in and go, "Hey, there was no bingo game. Hey, that everything he just said is untrue." When you take that person out, if it doesn't guarantee, it virtually guarantees the release of that inmate back into the community. And they don't get paroled to Manhattan Beach. Those guys, especially the asshole versions of them, get paroled to the same friggin' neighborhood that guys like Gascon profess to want to protect. There's a level of hypocrisy that is absolutely abhorrent to anybody that actually understands how it works. And that guy's next victim will be somebody poor, somebody who's undocumented,
In that community.
somebody, yeah, they like those people in those communities that are trying to make a better life. And look, I'll admit it, I have a soft spot for people that come up from countries that are fundamentally corrupt or poor. Like, as individuals, I've always had a soft spot. Like my soft spot, my old soft spot that has pretty much gone away for the homeless. It's still there for these guys that come up from countries that are trying to make their lives better, whether they're documented or not. And I cannot tell you how many crimes I saw, violent crimes, where they are the victims. And they're deliberately the victims by little gangsters or little a-holes or oftentimes parolees because they know that those people are going to be the last ones to report it
Mm.
because they don't want to cause any waves and they're afraid of getting
Mhm.
deported. And they deliberately will prey on them. A lot of those victims are sending money back to families that are depending on them. I had one victim he had a special needs son who was murdered. As a police officer or a prosecutor or anybody involved in the business, you do, like, your victim is your victim. Sometimes your victim is a little blonde haired girl. Sometimes your victim is a homeless person of color. You don't care. It's your victim is your victim. There's no hierarchy of status when it comes to you actually doing your job. And if you've got somebody that preyed on them and murdered them because they wanted their money or they wanted to F them to death or whatever it is, your job is to achieve justice for your victim and your family within the boundary of the law, but to ensure that the predatory bully a-hole who hurt them or killed them suffers the consequence commensurate with the pain and misery that they inflicted on others. And when you got somebody like Gascon, who day one says nobody is allowed to oppose their release anymore, anybody with a rational mind in LA, Democrat, independent, or Republican, should be not only wary of that, they should be freaking offended by that. And Gascon came in with that's one policy of dozens that were like that. Another one, he came in and he wanted to eliminate all enhancements on murders for like no more gang enhancements, no more three strikes. Three strikes is a controversial law, although the way it's actually applied, in my opinion, it shouldn't be controversial. But there's a lot of misinformation out there surrounding that. But Immediately, no enhancements. Okay, so what that means is that you can't do three strikes anymore. I represented the families of two murdered police officers who were, one of them was executed. He walked in on a burglary. The bad guy had a gun. He shot him, disabled the officer, and then, as the man is helpless, shot him 5 times in the face and then a sixth
Mm.
time in the badge. And that guy he'd been to prison multiple times. He was a documented gang member. It was an execution murder of a police officer. If things had worked out the way Gascon had wanted in that case, that guy could have had a parole hearing. I came into the case a couple of years after it had been filed, and Gascon comes in. That guy could have had a parole hearing in 8 years from the time that I came in on the case. That is insanity. That's not justice. And we fought and we won on that. This is a really long answer to your question. And this is not about Democrats and Republicans. That's just right or wrong. When you're talking about the murder of a human being, and that same police officer in that case was famous for he arrested a juvenile once, or he kept arresting the same juvenile, and he talked to him and he got to know him a little bit. And he said, why do you keep doing this? He's like, you're smart. You could do so well in school. He goes, well, I got no way to get to school. And for whatever reason, like the transportation, the bus, whatever, that cop, my murder victim, drove that kid to school every day for a year. Like would pick him up in the morning and drive him to school. That's everything that we want. I mean, that's above and beyond, but that's exactly what we want when you talk about good
Hmm.
cops, right? His name is Sergeant Owen. He was a wonderful man. His family loved him to death. His coworkers loved him to death, and that kid loved him to death. And he got executed by some a-hole shitbag gangster who got the drop on him. And that guy, the policies of George Gascon could have released that man in 8 years. That's just morally wrong. It is morally wrong. And he would have victimized somebody else. And eventually that guy was sentenced to life without possibility of
Hmm.
parole. Thank God. So I'll tell you what, when you come in as a prosecutor, you need to be politically neutral. You cannot let politics affect any charging decision you make. That's the way it's supposed to be. But then the flip side is you got a guy like Gascon who, he wants to release people like that, but he aggressively prosecuted every police officer he could. That also is wrong. There can't be a two-tiered system of justice. You have to be fair to everybody who's accused of a crime. And it is critically important that prosecutors who are invested with that immense power of being able to charge people with crimes, from misdemeanors on up to murders, you have to be as neutral and judicious as you possibly can. And the name of the game is fairness. So yeah, when it comes to that, it's not that it makes me more conservative. It's that I find that the position of the extreme left on violent crime is abhorrent
Hmm.
to me. It really is. It's like that you talk about toxic empathy, and we see this in the way the California legislature has enacted a lot of laws. Like it's like they have forgotten about the victims of violent crime, and it's all about the bad guy. For the hardworking people that just want to make their lives a little bit better and support their families and want their kids to be safe. I'm a big fan of Bill
Hmm.
Maher. And Bill Maher had a great line. I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. And it's kind of the same thing. It's not, and that's not Democrats, guys. I'm talking
Yeah.
about the hard left. Most of the best trial judges I know are like actual registered Democrats, believe it or not. And I hope that doesn't come off as too much of a
No, no,
rant.
it's
But
perfect.
look, when you deal with a crying mother who lost their child because some freaking a-hole killed them in a robbery or kidnapped and raped them, you lose sympathy for the bad guy really quick. You still have to be fair to them as a prosecutor, but when you see the visceral, actual impact of violent crime on good people and innocent people, it definitely evolves your viewpoint.
Can I ask something that's a bit on the flip side? I just want to know what this is like for you when you have prosecuted somebody and they have done something evil and awful. What is it like for the person who does realize that they did something evil and awful? Like, what is that like for you then the moment that they get it? Like, have you seen that genuine, like,
Oh yeah.
oh,
No, for
and
sure.
so what
Yep.
I want to know, like, does it seems like it would be a very conflicting emotion as opposed to the a-hole who doesn't get it. You can just say good riddance, but it almost seems like just a fucking tragedy. Now I'm cussing. Look what you did, Matt. It
Yeah,
just seems
sorry.
like a tragedy if somebody does something awful and then you look at their face the moment that they get that they did something irreversible. What is that like for you as a prosecutor? The person who does have remorse.
Yeah, I can give you an example of that. And look, as a prosecutor, you are ethically required to keep an open mind and to listen and to consider any new evidence that comes in. I had a case involving, it was a DUI, it was called a Watson murder. So it's this guy who gets in an argument with his wife. He's lived an exemplary life up to this point, gets in a huge argument with his wife. This is at the Spectrum in Irvine. He winds up throwing his phone across the room and it shatters into a million pieces. And long story short, he drives up the 405 freeway doing about 150 miles an hour. He takes out, and he's highly intoxicated. He takes out a family going to a 13-year-old's birthday party. The mom dies. The father's permanently disabled. A 10-year-old boy dies. A little girl is permanently disabled. So it is absolutely horrific, right? And we finish the preliminary hearing. So the judge leaves the bench. He's bound over. And this guy, he had a famous defense lawyer. And this guy breaks down and begins to cry. There was nobody to impress. It wasn't a manipulation. He's heard the evidence on his case, breaks down and cries. I had eye contact with him, and I realized at that moment he was one of those guys you're talking about. Like, he was a decent human being who had one really, really bad night, and the consequences were beyond horrific. But I had two dead bodies in that case. We wound up trying it and I won it, and the defense was 100% unsuccessful. So I convict him, and I was in front of a really good judge. Now I have the option of asking that each life get full consecutive sentences. Okay, so it would be essentially 15 plus 15 for the two deaths. I'm a big believer that every case is fact dependent, but nobody should get discounts for multiple crimes. Like, it's not like Black Friday sale. There's no 2 for 1. But
Hmm.
this was one where I really believe this guy had genuine remorse. And I really believe that equity and fairness required, and by the way, it's different use of the word equity than what we're hearing these right now. I mean, like, true fairness as being a court of equity, which is what criminal law is supposed to be, courts of fairness. I really thought that it was satisfied by doing one sentence. So I asked the judge to sentence him concurrent instead of consecutively on the two murders. And I wrestled with that. But that's the job of a prosecutor. You're supposed to struggle with those things. And it's really easy just to go full consec on everything. But I really believe that that was a guy that understood the horror of what he had done. And so he was going to take a hit. I think he was paroled after about 16 years for that. We charge murder in order to get justice for the victims. At the same time, you have to be fair to the defendant. So I asked that they be run concurrently. And it's one of those things. There's no black or white bright line, what's right and what's wrong. But yeah, it definitely can happen. But for the victims, there still has to be a consequence for the action.
Hmm.
The question is, what is the fairest consequence? What is the right consequence? Yeah, it's a struggle. And sometimes they do that. Honestly, most murderers made it really easy. And I never had to deal with that dilemma because most of them killed somebody on purpose and deserved everything that they got as a result.
What is a mistake that people who murder make? Because it seems like with all of the technology, I mean, like when you hear about the murder from the dating game murder, you can kind of see where there's less communication, less technologies, and how people can get away with it. How can they skip around? But now with everything, is it people too caught up? Do they have laser focus and they're missing the details? Like, what is an error that people make that they get caught? Or wait,
Well,
are we revealing too much? I don't want to give a
no,
how
no,
to.
no, no, no.
I don't want to give a guide.
So one of my old detectives, Larry Montgomery, who I love to death, Josh Mankiewicz called him the evidence whisperer because he was born to be a homicide detective, and the guy's a genius. Larry used to say it's almost always their first rodeo. For anybody that's listening that plays golf, the first time you do something, for me, golf in particular, you just suck at it so badly. So what are mistakes that people make when they commit murders? Oftentimes it's their first killing and only killing, and they make nothing but mistakes. Again, there's in the taxonomy of murders, there's so many different types. But for those that are trying to get away with it, like that's why you see serial killers really do. It's like Silence of the Lambs. They really do evolve over time. But their evolution is they tend to get better and they learn from experience in the killing itself. My Ernie Alice case went from the guy started with a knife and he went after a young college student in a parking lot and he murdered her. In that scene, a car came along. The investigation was intense because she was so popular. He went from knives and then he started tying up his victims, and it started out with rope, and then he realized handcuffs were the best way, and so he started out with knives, and then he went to guns, but that was really loud, so it was guns, knives, and then it was manual strangulation at gunpoint. So you see them get better and better over it, and you see them learn. It depends on the kind of murder, but there's always mistakes, thank God, because, otherwise they'd be a lot harder to catch.
I have one burning question. I want to get back to the woman of the hour. I don't know how your time frame is.
I'm
In my
good.
one of my philosophy classes, we'll talk about debates in sexuality, and the film Woman of the Hour came up. And the reason why that film had caught my attention was because the buzz around it, that there was this divide, that women seemed to like it more than men. And so that instantly got my curiosity. I wanted to watch it for myself and see where could this be happening. And then as I'm watching the film, I realized, oh, I see why women find this absolutely intense and creepy, because I was on pins and needles the entire film, and it was because of the silence. And it was because of the cultural creepiness that every single woman knows that silence when walking to your car at night is scary as hell. But if a young man is watching it and he's looking for, explosions and nudity and stuff, and this film doesn't have that, then it might come across as boring to the man because he doesn't fit that paradigm. He doesn't understand that point of view. What I thought was so fascinating with the film was the role of the cultural context. And that was making me think about your work. And when we are talking about sexual assault, that for some cases in particular, when we put sexual in front of assault, even though legally that's significant to describe the type of assault, that there seems to be a shrug, especially if it's like a middle-aged man who is, maybe harassing or touching, people kind of shrug and be like, but that's what men do. And women are for that. Like, the old romantic films, the man chases the woman and grabs her and kisses her, and there's no problem. But if we just say assault, then everybody can recognize how problematic that is. So from your point of view, I know my students would also love, what did you think about that film and the way that it portrayed a serial killer as opposed to other films? Like, what did you think was unique about it? And then what do you think about the cultural impact when we're talking about the gravity of sexual assault, that sometimes, unless it's extremely brutal, unless it happens to a child, but if it just happens to a woman going to work, it doesn't seem to resonate in the same way. Like, you can hold the highest political office, commit sexual assault, and people will give it a shrug, like it's not that big of a deal, as opposed to any other crime. So I would just love to know what your point of view is on that.
So yeah, and it's a really interesting question. I think there's layers to it. Number one, full disclosure, I got to work with Anna Kendrick on the movie. She brought me in, so I got to consult a little bit. She was wonderful. So I'm totally biased on this one. I think that this what you really hit the nail on the head when it comes to women walking through parking lots, like that silence, that scene. Oh, I thought that was amazing. And the way that Anna Kendrick set that up and that whole thing was just masterfully done, I thought. One of the things is men don't have that same experience because it's different. Men don't fear another man in the way that a woman walking alone at night in a parking lot would. They don't have that sort of emotional reference point in their own lives typically. I think that one of the reasons why men might have been less interested in that movie is just that generally it seems like the audience for true crime, I don't know why it is, but it's just overwhelmingly women in general. So just true crime, I could see guys being like, "Oh, okay," but that's sort of the audience, and why that is, I don't know. But I think a way to engage men in the conversation of sexual assault is, I think that those old dinosaurs are really, if not a dead breed, kind of a dying breed, or at least mostly dying breed. Like the office guys that are touching women and all that. It's still out there, of course, a little bit, but I think that culturally, I think we're a lot more sophisticated now than we were even like 5 or 6 years ago on that topic. That people
Mm-hmm.
really have to be careful. But I think the way to engage men in the topic of sexual assault is, it's a pretty easy thing to get a guy, if he's thinking about his buddy in the cubicle down the hall, is one thing, like somebody complaining because he told a dirty joke. It's another thing when you put a man in the mindset of, hey, your mom or your sister is in Anna Kendrick's position walking to that car. That has a completely different response, I think, from men. So when we're talking about assault, I think that there's a pretty broad spectrum between something, and it's all wrong, of course, but something between like a dirty joke on one end in the harassment context to like a rape and murder on the other. in fact, I don't even know if we could put those on the same spectrum. But
Hmm.
I think that when you're talking about things that anybody would recognize as sexual assault, like what Rodney Alcala was doing or Andrew Rudialis, the true sexual predators, having presented a lot of those cases to juries, I've never had an issue with men engaging properly in that and understanding the enormity of it. And when it comes to even, I prosecuted 3 pure date rape cases when I was in sexual assault, and again, I never personally had an issue with getting men to engage in that. Like I never hung a case because a couple of bros were, high-fiving and think it was funny. I just never have personally encountered that as a prosecutor. Now, I did represent, I part of my practice is I represent women who've been sexually harassed. I did a bunch of pro bono work for rape victims right when I left the DA's office. For those women, I think that they did encounter a lot of what you're talking about. It was more date rape context, and that was a very high profile case, but they were women who were voluntarily meeting with the guy who was allegedly abusing them, and there was allegations of GHB involved in that case, which is a drug that essentially incapacitates people. I definitely got hints of that at various stages in that where I couldn't get enough people to take it seriously, and that can be a maddening thing. So I think my answer is officially
Hmm.
all over the board for you. I don't know if I if I answered your
No, that's
question or
okay.
not.
No, I mean, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to convey about how ingrained it is for
Hmm.
women to be on guard all the time. I've told my students, I mean, I live in close to the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, and I enjoy running. They have a 5K track
Hmm.
there. But as soon as winter hits and it gets dark at 4:45, my running schedule is off. If I don't get home from work until 4:30, then that means I can't go out in the dark with my headphones on and do 5K. And so it cuts off a lot of my freedom out of safety,
Hmm.
that no woman walks to her car at night or goes out at night alone feeling, not guarded in some way. I
Hmm.
mean, the other day I took a lift. My family was at the park. There was a festival and I had some work to do. So I said, go ahead and I'll just lift there. And then when I got in the car, the driver made some sort of a comment like, I'm going to take longer. I'm going to go this way. I said, oh, that's okay. I understand this LA traffic. Like, I take my daughter to school this way. And then he says, oh, you have a daughter. And immediately, it's just completely innocent question.
Hmm.
But immediately I felt on guard. Like, I don't know that people realize that you're just constantly aware that something bad can happen when you're around a strange man or you are alone. And so my immediate response was alerting that my family is waiting for me, to let signal to this person that there are other people waiting for me to arrive, like a precautionary thing. And that's just something that women live with. And that's why I'm wondering, like, is this what role does culture play when we shrug at sexual assault and then you've got the actual crimes happening, or is it decreasing? Is it going up? I mean, from your end, people talk about crime. Is it going down, or is it going up, or is it the same?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, LA County crime has been skyrocketing. Mark Twain has a great quote. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah.
And I don't care who is saying it, crime in Los Angeles has exploded. It's certainly over the last 4 years since COVID. And let
Mm.
me tell you, anybody who tries to tell you different is friggin' lying to you, or they're ignorant. Crime here in Southern California is definitely on the upswing. And I will happily debate anybody who wants to come at me with FBI statistics or anything else, because oftentimes that stuff is deliberately skewed for the purpose of political debate. But I think that as one of the things that we have going for us, especially in that context, because what you're afraid of is you're afraid of the sexual predator, as you should be. That is where modern forensic science, I think, has been a boon for public safety, because we tend to catch these guys a lot sooner now. The rapist who in the 1970s would get away with 20 rapes before they finally get caught is now, in a perfect world, getting caught after one if they're leaving DNA. And I think nationwide, and that's another thing that drove me crazy in the summer of 2020 and probably into the summer of 2021. The whole concept of defund the police. Essentially, the way that works is if you cut money from police departments, the detectives, the education programs, the forensic science, and the detectives are the first to go. And those are the ones that solve all those crimes. So it's like anybody who says defund the police, and I think they're ignorantly essentially advocating for sexual predators, because they're the number one beneficiary of that will be child molesters, rapists, and people who murder people concurrent with rapes. we're getting much better in catching those guys sooner. We haven't seen a flourishing of serial killers like we did in like the late 70s and early 80s, which is a fascinating thing in its own right. I think that sort of the accumulation of social and population and everything that came together during that period of time. You know, the area of like the Hillside Strangler here in Southern California, or Rodney Alcala, or Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, like it was like the golden era of serial killers back then. I think the only thing that has saved us from that again is that so many of those guys, because they're all around, they're still around. It's just they're getting caught after their first or second rape, and they're getting DNA hits are coming in. They haven't evolved yet into the serial murderers that they are on track to become if they were left unchecked. And I mean, we saw that with we saw that with all of those guys, how they just did rape after rape after rape. And also, I was the prosecutor on the Golden State Killer case for Orange County, the Joseph D'Angelo case. And a lot of those guys will start out as peeping toms, and then they work up to frottage, where they're touching women outside. And, you know, they get more. It takes more and more. It's almost like an addiction where they graduate to murder. Some of them get there much faster than others. But if we're catching those guys after one rape and putting them in prison, they're in prison. In that respect, it's at least a little bit safer as forensic science catches up. But also, you know, like you've got the Lake and Riley case, where it doesn't matter if that guy was in the system or would have been in the system because he'd only been here for a couple months and God only knows what he did. And there's a lot of factors
Hmm.
that play there. And also, just listen, just hearing that on an emotional level, like it makes me so
Yeah.
sad and a little angry. The idea that, you know, that you have to worry about daylight savings. And of course you do. I grew up in LA. It's always been that way. And I hope somebody has bought pepper spray for you. I've bought pepper spray at one point or another for virtually every woman in my life, from my sister to my mom back in the day. And every woman I've dated, I think it's like I come along with a gift of pepper spray, because that really can help, I think.
I've heard this as a conundrum. If you are, let's say, as a woman, let's say somebody is about to approach you, they are about to harm you, and before they make contact, you spray them. Wouldn't you then be responsible for assault instead of the person coming at you?
Yeah, you probably would. I think you need to be able to
Ah,
articulate a little
okay.
more. That's actually a crime in the state of California, offensive use of pepper spray. So, but you know,
Unless there's a
the creepy
camera.
dude who won't leave you alone and you say, back off, I'm not interested or whatever, anything past the word no, I think the law says good spraying to you, madam.
You have written this fabulous book. I mean, you're very successful. Your joining good is in the details. But the most important thing that I have to ask you is that you mentioned Descartes in one of your chapters. So, did you study philosophy?
I was a philosophy major at UCSB until, and actually, ironically, until I hit Descartes, and then it was like my pea brain and Descartes. I mean, weirdly, I sort of understand him almost even better now. But I decided that I was gonna switch to switch to poli sci, where I could get into more concepts. But no, I love philosophy. Total philosophy nerd, from the Stoics all the way up to some of the modern people that are out there now. Ryan Holiday has some
Oh,
great books
yeah.
out there on ancient Stoicism,
Yeah.
which I think are great.
I
Yeah.
knew you had some. I knew it. But that's also one of the joys in talking with you because, I mean, I am, with my books, I'm with the theories, I'm in the university classroom. And so we're talking about these things, but I need the real world. Like, we can have these debates about free will versus determinism, but I need to know, well, who are the people who are actually interacting with this in a concrete manner? Is the serial killer determined?
Yeah.
Or is he prosecuted because he could have chosen otherwise? Or is there something inherent in his brain or her brain? And so that's why it's just lovely to talk with you. And I'm so grateful. Matt, I can't even tell you, I've recommended your book to so many people. And
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you.
you've done great work. It's also great storytelling without being exploitive. And that's really important in true crime, I think, is that you're telling the story without exploiting or harming the victims. You remember that there are people, and that really hit me when I listened to your book on audiobook, that you always kept the victims at the center of the case and the
Well,
impact.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I tried to do that as much as I could. And a lot of homicide cases in California take years and years to come to trial, and you become very important to the surviving victims' families. So I appreciate you saying that, because that was something that I really wanted to. I wanted to be very careful to make sure that they were getting their due and that everybody understood that it was kind of for them. In fact, I dedicated the book to the victims of violent
Mm-hmm.
crime. And also, hopefully it's educational. Hopefully people understand it. But talk about, the academic world. I heard a great quote that engineering is simply applied physics and the law is just applied philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Really kind of poignant, right? It's taking, that's the idea of the law, is taking those sort of esoteric concepts of what is right, what is just, what is the fair thing, and trying to hone it down into actionable, functional, legal concepts. It's one of the things that's so interesting about the law for me is that philosophy is actually it's a great foundation for it, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for that last soundbite, Matt. I'm going to have all my students listen to that.
Good.
All right. Well, you have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you so much. And happy to come back anytime.
Matt, this was awesome. I hope to see you around Manhattan Beach. Maybe we can grab a drink sometime.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. Remember to check out our show notes that you can get Matt Murphy's book. It is amazing, I guarantee it. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, AvonmoreInc.com. It's that small bridge business that started in the 90s and grew to an international sensation amongst bridge players. Go to AvonmoreInc.com to plan your next bridge party and let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Remember to check us out on Instagram, take a screenshot of this episode or your favorite episode and tag us. Good is in the Details Pod, also on Facebook. Check out the show notes to book your next photo shoot with Jamie Fisher of Fishy Photo, link in the show notes. And check out our Patreon, patreon.com/goodisinthedetails. You can join our book club, get extra content, and support the pod for as little as $2 a month. Okay, until next time, bye.